Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to a Tuesday edition of Webinar Wednesday. I'm Eric Poole with Facts Institute for County Government. And today we're going to turn our attention back to some of the federal relief that has gone into law, as well as some that is about to go into law in the next probably couple of days. We're going to be picking up on some of the earlier conversations we had in January on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that was part of the 900 billion stimulus package that was signed into law on December 27th, 2020. I think everyone knows in that appropriation, Congress designated 25 billion for the rental assistance program for Florida. They got a very large chunk, about 1.4 billion. And the funding for counties is to occur in two ways: cities and counties with populations of 200,000 and above. For counties, that's about 26 counties. They had to apply directly to Treasury to get the funds by midnight on January the 12th. And then all other communities, counties, cities will have to seek funding from the state, and that'll be managed by the Department of Children and Families, not Florida Housing Finance Corporation. But we're actually going to begin by a look forward, and we're going to have our presenters talk about the legislation that passed the House, was amended in the Senate, and is being taken up either today or tomorrow, and hopefully signed into law later this week. So earlier in January, we had a webinar where we talked about this. A lot of the rules from Treasury were just coming out. But to go back over some of those requirements and discuss options for how to manage your own local program, I'm pleased to welcome back Brad Gare and Matt Urchel with Witt O'Brien's. Witt O'Brien's is a FAT corporate partner. They're also a full-service emergency management and disaster recovery firm that does work all across the country, including Florida. So I want to welcome Brad and Matt back. And with that as the backdrop, Brad, I'm going to give you the camera and you can get us going.
Thank you very much, Eric, and good afternoon to everyone that in the Florida family of counties. Glad that we could be with you again today to continue talking about these very important topics. As Eric said, we'll talk a little bit about the American Rescue Plan, preview that for you, but especially in the context of how that piggybacks onto the Emergency Rental Assistance Program funding that's already been distributed. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on each. If you have questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the Q&A and we'll answer those as we go. Any questions that we do not get a chance to answer during the presentation, we will make sure that we get the answers to you afterwards. And as always, we know that the presentation will be made available to you on the website, and any questions you have subsequent to that, happy to answer those as well. So thank you again very much. Next slide, please, Matt. So we are your speakers today. Brad Gare, I'm a principal with Witt O'Brien's, and you know us very well, so we won't go into too much of our own introductions. Matt is the head of our division that handles all community services nationwide, and he's been running our entire coronavirus program package. Next slide, please. We are doing quite a bit of this work nationally, and I think that helps us to be able to speak to you as we present this information, not just from sort of a general perspective, but also with the actual learnings of what's going on out there, what's happening right now. And we can tell you that we're working in 80 different jurisdictions already for state, local, and some tribal governments, as well as territories on various aspects of coronavirus relief. So I think we've got a lot of good information to share with you. We've done the whole gamut of programs, and certainly we're going to focus mostly today on the rental assistance program, but also start talking again about the American Rescue Plan. Next slide, please, Matt. As Eric said, this bill is on its way to being enacted this week, thankfully, because we know that some of the important benefits for Americans are going to expire if it doesn't happen soon. So this is expected to be enacted this week. The American Rescue Plan contains a lot of different things in there for state and local government. It also has, for the first time, some help with revenue shortfalls and some other very, very important things in there for state and local government. So we'll talk just a bit about that, but we really want to focus on how that is going to piggyback onto the emergency rental assistance program by adding yet additional dollars to that program, extending the time frame of it, as well as adding an all new program for mortgage assistance. And just remember, as we talk through this, and the guidance does keep changing from Treasury, mostly for the good. By the way, we're happy to see that. But we see that it's not just rental assistance. We all know by now it's utility assistance, some other important related assistance to renters, including now internet can be paid for. So that's with some cautions from Treasury about being careful to make sure you have enough money for the rent and utilities, but the internet is now also eligible. It hasn't been included as a utility because there's a lot of debate that's gone on for years at the federal government in various programs of whether or not internet is a utility. So that's why you'll see that with some slightly different wording in the Treasury guidance. With that, I'm going to pass it to Matt to walk us through the details, a little bit on the American Rescue Plan and how to implement your ERAP programs. If you haven't gotten those off the ground yet, you're in good company because most jurisdictions are either just getting ready to or just have begun to accept applications. So Matt, over to you.
Thank you so much, Brad. And thank you for joining us today. What I'm currently showing on the screen is a lot to digest and synthesize when it's just shown on the screen. So obviously this webinar will be sent out. What we've done is taken the $1.9 trillion package and actually pulled out the relevant allocations of funds on a national level so that you can see what it looks like. There are some changes that just happened as a result of the Senate amendment. So we may see some of the individual assistance amounts changes. There was also some adjustments to the local government allocations in the most recent Schumer amendment. So we'll keep a close eye on what happens from the House. But what I really wanted to be able to reflect to everybody here today is that there is a lot of funding that's coming out of this next relief bill. And if you start to look at your community and how you've been impacted by COVID-19 and are starting to stand up some of these bespoke programs, my primary message to you is just a word of caution. Whereas the Coronavirus Relief Fund was a very hyper flexible use of funds. And while there were some entitlement and traditional allocations of funds under annually appropriated programs, this is rather historic funding through a lot of those existing programs. So when you looked at how you spent your coronavirus relief funds, to address economic needs in your community, to help reinforce child care initiatives within your community, to provide rental assistance and mortgage assistance within your community, to help some of your hospitals, to help some of your cities, to help some of your townships or even constitutionals, right? There are a lot of programs that you created using this flexible CRF program. But if you really start to look through each one of these line items, you'll come to find that there is large allocations of funds being provided to bespoke programs specifically to address those. So $130 billion more to K through 12 on top of what they received in HR 133, on top of what they received in the CARES Act, additional allocations to the higher education institutions, the GERS funds. This is now the third appropriation of funds under the Child Care Development Block Grants, to which states will be administering very impactful programs around. But some of your child care providers will also be able to access a stabilization fund that's going to be administered both at a state and federal level. Another large appropriation of funds to Head Start. So child care initiatives really starting to get available funding. Vaccination support services really being supported by FEMA for reimbursement. And then, of course, there is this, what we'll call CRF 2.0, right? This $350 billion that's going to be distributed, not just to states, but directly to local governments, and taking it a step further down to entitlement municipalities and non-entitlements through a state block grant program. So be really interesting to see how that actually materializes within the state of Florida, but there is going to be rather significant allocations. I do want to just spend a minute talking about that CRF 2.0 that we'll call it, just so that everybody understands the general framework of that, how the money is going to be carved up. Most of the funding, or let's just call it half the funding, will go directly to states, and then they'll be able to create programs themselves. I think what everybody's really looking at is that this can be used for revenue replacement, which is a deviation from the existing coronavirus relief fund. But the most important part of this is that local governments get direct allocations, and they've dropped that whole $500,000 population threshold to be a direct recipient. And so now entitlements down to the smallest level of government, 50,000 or greater, and then non-entitlements like such as townships and cities will actually get funding directly as the bill is currently written. It also has a rather lengthy timeline on use of funds. And so instead of having these deadlines to which everybody was spending funding quickly and not thinking about impactful uses of funds, you have until 2024 as the bill is currently written. So just touching on that state allocation, 195 billion, minimum 500 million. Florida's going to get a rather large allocation of this funding. And keep in mind, the local allocations don't come out of the state. The state can use that money for themselves, and so they don't have to distribute any of it to the local governments. Counties, 65 billion, directly allocated using that sort of CDBG model of entitlement distributions. Where this program significantly differs from the Coronavirus Relief Fund and that distribution methodology is the non-county municipalities getting direct allocations and the non-entitlements getting allocations. We have seen a couple of different estimates that were developed. NACO had developed some estimates. The Government Financial Officers Association has developed some estimates. The National Council of State Legislators also has some estimates. They're all generally in line because they use different frameworks of how they came up with those, but they're all, within the margin of error. So we have a pretty good baseline of how much money each of the local governments and non-entitlements are going to receive. And what I'll really kind of frame up as we look at the eligible uses of funds for those non-entitlements is you can, just like you did for the CRF program, you can use it to respond to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19, but then they also have a specific call out for the negative economic impacts associated with some of the closures and safety protocols put in place for the public health crisis. So those can be more programs to help individuals directly, small businesses, nonprofits, impact industries such as tourism, travel, hospitality. This is a very flexible use of funds, and I think it'll be up to your jurisdiction to determine how you want to use it. But where we also see a bit deviation is you can use some of this to provide premium pay to eligible workers. So that could be hazard pay or just incentives to bring those individuals back into the workplace and provide grants to eligible employers. Well, interesting terminology here, eligible employers. We'll have to see how Treasury actually determines what an eligible employer is. But the important part here is you can start to create more grant programs to help incentivize economic opportunity within your community. To help address some of the economic impacts, you can also use some of the funding to replace the reduction in revenue from sales of property or income taxes due to the public health emergency that you've experienced over the last year. You can also start to use this for making necessary investments to your water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure. What was interesting in sort of the disparity of a state CRF administered program versus a direct recipient CRF program, many of the direct recipients, if they felt like they could justify something to the Treasury, they would advance that specific initiative. For many of the counties on this call, you received money directly from the Florida Department of Emergency Management, and they had very different standards for what they considered to be eligible based on their risk tolerance. As a direct recipient of funds, many of you will be able to make that determination yourself. And we now see more flexible use to do some of those broadband infrastructures, which were somewhat non-allowable in the most recent CRF just because of the timeline. An important note on number one here, they really just frame this up to express the congressional intent. So you don't have to limit programs to just households, small businesses, nonprofits. What Brad didn't touch on around this American Rescue Plan is it starts to resemble a stimulus package in a lot of ways. So it's not just individual payments or payments to individuals. You could also do a fair amount of workforce development and economic resiliency with some of this funds, understanding that it's all the way until 2024. So real and important to look at this more holistically and say, I don't just have to address the more acute need. There's probably some strategic advantage into looking long term. That said, the relief bill does also outline some non-allowable use of funds and limitations on that. So some of these are more applicable to states and they don't exist in the non-entitlement and municipal language of the bill. But states are not allowed to use the funds to either directly or indirectly offset a reduction in net tax revenue. So can't give out tax breaks and then replace it because you've lost revenue. You also can't use the funds to for the deposit into any pension funds. That appears to be across all funding streams. So you wouldn't be able to use it on a local level for that. However, you are allowed to transfer it to private nonprofit organizations or a public benefit corporation for transportation, passengers, cargoes, and special purpose units of local government. Well, you'll have to look very carefully at exactly what that transfer looks like. Again, going back to that terminology, this looks a lot more like a stimulus bill in some respects, and you have very flexible use of funds, the ARRA type model. What I want to caution around this, though, is we will have to look at what the Treasury puts in place for accountability, both on the reporting side, but also on the monitoring side. I think it's impractical for the Treasury to be able to administer monitoring for thousands of jurisdictions. And so they may be somewhat lax in what that protocol looks like. But we do know that the uniform guidance principles that are likely to come into play here are going to be significant, and it's your jurisdictional responsibility to ensure that you follow them. So more to come, but I think the important piece of this is that this is very flexible use of funds. I touched just very briefly on those reporting requirements. We will have to see what that looks like. The covered period, March 3rd, 2020 through the last end of the date of the fiscal for some of the tax revenue and offsetting that. That's important for your adopted budget. It also indicates that you have to provide periodic reports. We don't know the format of that. We don't know the frequency of that. Those are things we'll have to wait to see for a guidance on. And then if you don't comply with any of these provisions in the bill, you would be required to pay the money back to the Treasury in the equal amounts of the funds used in violation of those guidance. So that's important to keep in mind from the cost principles and uniform guidance side of this. On administration use of the funds, the deadline to spend funds as it's currently written would be December 31st, 2024. So here we sit in 2021. The previous coronavirus relief fund really only gave like a 9-month timeline on expending funds. There's actually quite a bit more time here. There are some specified timelines on how quickly the money has to go out from the Treasury. And then more importantly, the timeline that the state has to provide the funding directly to non-entitlements. And then I call this one out specifically because of how important it is. The bill would also provide $117 million of oversight and promote transparency and accountability for all of the federal coronavirus relief funds. And the reason why I call that out is because that is a significant allocation of funds directly to fund some of those oversight responsibilities at the federal level. So, I just mentioned that we don't know the practicality of the Treasury being able to administer concurrent monitoring of thousands of recipients. Well, they just got a fair amount of cash to help with that. So we'll keep an eye on exactly what that looks like from an OIG perspective, but also how the Treasury starts to stand up some of their oversight operations and, more importantly, some of their reporting infrastructure. Stepping aside from that $350 billion allocation, they also have this set aside for capital or critical capital projects. And they specify this as enabling work, education, health monitoring, including remote options in response to the COVID-19 public health emergency. There's a significant TBD on this one of how that money is actually going to be allocated, whether it's going to be on a population proportionality, if it's going to be a structured block grant or a competitive grant program. We'll want to keep a very close eye on that. But again, more money that's looking long-term at some of these capital improvements that you may want to make within your community to help become both more economically and from a public health perspective, more resilient. I'm going to go ahead and jump to what this means for Florida counties. And again, I'm putting this with the caveat that these are based on estimates. And again, most of the estimates that we've seen from some of the more reliable sources all are very close. And so I think that these numbers are going to be close to reality, but I'll just caveat that they are estimates, so don't take them to the bank. But as you can see, there is significant allocations of funds being provided to counties. But where this starts to step away from some of the coronavirus relief funds is that there was also 63 cities within the states that are considered entitlements that are going to be getting direct allocations, Tallahassee, Tampa, Miami, North Miami, right? So they're getting a total in aggregate of about 1.9 billion. that's separate than the county allocation. And then there's 352 non-entitlements, and that's all the way down to cities and townships within your jurisdictions that are getting another 785 under these estimates. And how this impacts you is that whereas in some of your coronavirus relief fund, you provided assistance directly to cities and townships and constitutionals, there is actually available funding to, at least to the cities and some of the townships. So you wouldn't have to do that this time around. They do have their own allocation of funds, and you can use some of this money yourself for some of those things that help make your county more resilient, but also if you want to start developing some economic, strategic economic projects, you would be able to use this funds for. I want to frame this up in the context that as we look at not just an additional allocation of emergency rental assistance money coming down in this next relief bill, there is also some available money to create more bespoke programs to help address some of these needs. And so the Treasury Program, as an example, limits participation to those that are 80% of AMI or under. And we know that jurisdictional LIHEAP programs allow you to choose what that income threshold is, and sometimes it could be 120% of the AMI. So if you were actually to take some of this money that you received in the next allocation and expand your existing emergency rental assistance program to help with transitional services, legal aid, but also expanding the eligibility criteria from 80 to 120, you could have a centralized interface for intake and then be able to just carve up which money pays for what. So if someone's between 80 and 120% in your community, you could use this CRF 2.0. If they're below 80%, they can go the route of the emergency rental assistance program money. And then probably more impactfully on the utility side, you may be able to drive them towards LIHEAP participation if they fit within those income thresholds as well, preserving even more of this rental assistance money for your community, which means you can help more people with it. So that's why I want to frame it up against the emergency rental assistance program is you're going to want to try to address the more urgent and pressing needs within your community, but there's ways that you can combine multiple funding sources to truly optimize delivery of the needs within your community or services to the needs within your community. And I'll also introduce that there is some consideration of being able to make sure you have the necessary support services for for other economic initiatives, some of your public health initiatives. You know, there's some ELC funds that are going to come down from the Department of Health at the state level, potentially as local grants. Your emergency management, you could actually help build some infrastructure around. So as you start to really look at this next pot of money and how you can use it, but how you can use it long-term, there's really a mindset of strategic investments, but you're going to be cross-cutting across some multiple departments within your county. So this is, I referenced it early on in the CARES Act and Coronavirus Relief Fund. This is a perfect opportunity to pull the functional leaders within each of your departments to really run a bit of a centralized recovery office for a period of time that can ensure that you're not duplicating any programs, but you're also leveraging all funding available to streamline delivery to those in need in your community. What I want to do now is focus on the emergency rental assistance program, understanding that you have more money coming in this next relief package for it. That starts to pivot the approach here from just trying to get the money out the door as quickly as possible to meet that September deadline of expenditures to more looking prospective, right? So how can we develop a program that addresses the continuous need in our community instead of looking backwards? And then how you're going to implement that on a jurisdictional level. So some of this is what we talked about previously around, you know, what the program is, what are some of the eligible uses of funds. As we've started to see additional guidance come out from the FAQs, you know, there's more flexibility on how you can use funds for some of the transitional services, but actually fall into the 90%. It's really great that Treasury is now collaborating with HUD, who runs traditional tenant-based income programs, who runs CDBG programs, who runs ESG programs, and are able to take some of the best hits from each of those programs and start to blend influence into this more flexible source of funds. So keep an eye on the FAQ guidance. We will continue to push out some guidance through FAC as it becomes available, fact sheets, interpretations of what that is. From a jurisdictional implementation perspective, many of you who are receiving direct allocations of funds have already started to stand up your programs, but some of you who haven't, I want to really push the narrative that that is okay, right? Because we still are under an eviction moratorium. If we're really looking at the program from the perspective of trying to avoid housing instability, the eviction moratorium is providing some protection for that. It is more important to stand up a program that can succeed than it is to stand up a program quickly. So if you can receive tens of thousands of applications, but if you don't have the right infrastructure and systems to be able to support a timely review of that, you're just going to be buried in incomplete or ineligible applications. So it's really important that you push really effective communication and outreach within your community to provide clear and concise messaging about the program, when it's going to launch, who's eligible, what documents they need to provide. There's also benefit in actually pulling together coalition partners within the community to help spread that message, but potentially to help you with implementation of your program. And then you looking at what you did with your coronavirus relief funds, looking at what programs you've already stood up. If your entitlement community, have you run ESG or CDBG type programs, tenant-based income programs? Can you replicate a lot of those processes? But most importantly, do you have the capacity to be able to support a function of what this program requires, understanding that whatever money you just received, there's more on the way, and you're going to be looking much more long-term, right? You're going to be looking at September 2022 instead of September 2021. So how do you build a program that is sustainable for a year and a half instead of a program that you can stand up and stand back down in 3 months? So many of you have started to make decisions about exactly what your implementation looks like. I want to spend just a couple of minutes talking about a variety of implementation models that we've seen from our support of states and local governments across the country, and what that means for a compliance and operational perspective. So the three main models that we see are the fully centralized operation, where the county is running effectively 100% of the operation. They're helping with the marketing and advertising and communication. They're procuring the software solution that actually is for intake. They're doing the application intake. They're doing call center support. They set the priorities and program designs. They make the eligibility determinations, and they make the payments directly to the individuals, the landlords, or the utility companies. However, not all counties have the capacity to be able to do that. Maybe the capabilities, not the capacity. So the idea there is you may leverage some use of a community partner to do a hybrid approach, where you leverage community partners within your organization or within your county who are already working with some of these at-need or impacted population groups, and then you move it to them handling some of the intake, them handling some of the communication, and then being able to distribute payments at the county level, determine prioritization at the county level, and do a final eligibility determination of award at the county level. So that actually is a shared responsibility between the nonprofit organizations or community partners and the county. And then finally, we have actually seen a number of counties that just don't have the capacity to do this whatsoever at all. That would require staffing up. I would caution here that while that looked like an attractive option to decentralize all of this and hand it over to a community partner writ large, that looked okay in the current model. But now, as you start to look at something that's sustainable over the course of 12 to 18 months, you may want to rethink that approach, because it may be advisable to go ahead and stand up that operation at a county level. Again, looking at it from the perspective of strategic initiatives and how you build capacity to support community members long-term. There is value in leveraging community members. There's also value in really making your community services or community development at a county level more robust. And this is an investment opportunity to be able to do that. Diving a little bit deeper into those models, I have some quick process flows of exactly what that looks like. So here, applicants would actually, you would have community engagement that was spearheaded by the county itself. You would have a centralized software system. There's a number of great systems out there to be able to help with this. Application intake would be done through the system, but also you may have some of your librarians or some jurisdictional partners like cities be able to take in some applications on paper if need be. use your 211 or 311 call center support services to focus on getting the inbound calls transferred to the right place. Really setting the prioritization standards at a county level, doing the eligibility review and determinations, hiring staff to do that review, and then doing the centralized payment processing. I will offer that one of the reasons we see so many jurisdictions choose to use community partners is because of that last piece, that payment processing, and just how difficult it is to register new vendors and their existing financial systems. What I will offer is you can find a financial partner to act in some respects as a fiduciary agent, and that doesn't necessarily have to be a community-based organization. That can be a bank. You can contract for centralized payment processing services that happen a bit outside of your financial standards, but still comply with all the federal regulations by issuing 1099s afterwards and doing a final reconciliation back against it. And most importantly, the account's in your name. You may need to look at what your jurisdictional limitations are on that, but that is a very streamlined way of getting this money out the door quickly without hitting some of the pitfalls of some of the governmental ERPs and also just vendor registration. So just a quick consideration around that. Again, I just want to highlight that hybrid model of kind of a paired approach of leveraging different community partners. My caution with using community partners, I am all for supporting community engagement, supporting infrastructure around these nonprofit organizations that have for the last year been working nonstop to provide critical services to those in need. There is a lot of benefit in having those organizations available for some of the continued case management services beyond the emergency rental assistance program, pointing those individuals to other services. However, many of them have been working very, around the clock. They're kind of at their limitation of existing support services, and layering additional funding or requesting them to take on additional services may push them over their breaking point. And so, especially as we look at the Coronavirus Relief Fund having more limited uniform guidance and 2 CFR 200 requirements, the Emergency Rental Assistance Program has much more rigorous requirements, and you will have to very actively monitor anyone that you provide funding to perform these services, especially if they're a pass-through entity or subrecipient. So that's my only caution there is you may end up in a situation where handing over everything to a community partner to run your program, you need to have a plan B, but also if you're going to use multiple community partners, you need to make sure that they're providing equitable service. So this model actually helps prevent some of those pitfalls because you can still use them to help individuals as they come in the door with filling out their application, helping bridge that digital divide. But then you can set the prioritization standards, and then you can have a much more limited, streamlined team that does the eligibility review and determinations. And then you can do that streamlined payment processing. So all the payments are coming from your organization, and you don't have to do some of those subrecipient monitoring components that you would if you had actually done the decentralized model. Just a consideration on the decentralized model. If you are going to use one or more nonprofit organizations or community partners to run your program, and that includes giving them funding directly. If you use more than one of them, my real word of caution here is you need to have a mechanism of providing effective training to all of them, but also monitoring them, and not just from a program integrity and quality assurance. There's another component, which is, let's say you use 3 different community partners, you assign a number of cases to each one of them, but one of the community partners isn't performing at the same standard as the other 3, and they happen to be serving a particularly high-risk group of individuals. Now you're providing somewhat inequitable services because of the performance of one of your community partners. So you need to be able to effectively monitor the implications of that and how you can quickly step in to either reassign services or augment their services so that you are providing that equitable service to those at-risk population groups. So that's just one of the pitfalls of doing a fully decentralized model is you lose a lot of ability to ensure both consistency and integrity, but also equitable distribution of assistance. That's not to say that it's not an effective approach, especially for small jurisdictions that are just limited in capacity, but you can augment that capacity. So again, you hear Brad say all the time, this is not an advertisement, but you can bring on a professional services firm to help with some of that oversight, to help with some of that training, to help with some of that augmentation. So really quickly, what model is the right one for you? It's that first assessment of understanding what your capacity and capability is, and then making the determination if you want to build that capacity in-house, or if you are comfortable using some of those community partners or hiring someone to do this. I think that now is a very critical time if you haven't made a determination of who's going to run your program for emergency rental assistance, because there may be value in standing up another, COVID-19 team or CARES Act team that is nimble, and that can actually help run a variety of programs, economic relief programs, individual assistance programs, mortgage programs. Because we know that there is more of this funding coming down, there's value in looking at this more holistically and strategically, building the infrastructure for your organization that can actually be sustainable for the next 16, 18, 24 months to continuously provide assistance, but to also mitigate some of the economic impacts by standing up stimulus type activities or economic and workforce development activities, helping some of the larger employers in your areas, or if they just didn't make it, making sure that you're pivoting your support services to become a more economic resilient community. When you do that assessment, I mentioned the financial systems. This is such a great opportunity to do a quick valuation of those and understand if that's an area of capital improvement that you want to make. Those are ERP upgrades or something that typically take more than just a couple of months. And so you may not be able to accomplish them with your coronavirus relief fund. This may be a great opportunity to do it now, especially with some of the more advanced solutions that are available, but also just your IT infrastructure across all of your departments. This is an opportunity to evaluate them and see if you can become a leaner or more efficient organization in providing services to your community members. All that being said, if you still make that assessment that you're not able to do this yourself, you may want to look at those community partners or agencies within the community that manage affordable housing initiatives, homelessness, or those types of similar programs, especially if you're trying to hit that last mile of service to provide sustainable support to those population groups. You want to make sure that they have experience running grant programs, and where I would caution you against saying like, well, they ran coronavirus relief fund. We knew how flexible those funds were for the coronavirus relief fund. So I would try to hold it to a little bit different standard there and make sure that they understand some of the more rigorous 2 CFR 200 compliance considerations that are applicable to this funding source that were comparable to the coronavirus relief fund. Something we've seen across the country is that they need to be scalable. And that means that they are not just addressing this program. This is where you can look at how can we pick a community partner that can be nimble and we could provide additional funding to when other programs can be stood up for those economic relief or individual assistance types programs. And then, of course, just understanding the demographics of your community and what individuals over the last year haven't been able to access assistance. This is a great opportunity to do a retrospective to just evaluate who was best served, who was underserved with the previous programs that were accessible at the federal, state, and local level, and where can we apply specific focus to help overcome language, cultural, or technology oriented barriers, and then who is best positioned to be able to actually help us bridge that gap. So those are all very important considerations in evaluating what that looks like. So I'm going to hit pause there, and I've seen a couple of questions pop up. Brad, I'm going to kick it back over to you and see if there's anything you feel like I missed in that run through.
Thank you, Matt. That was very, very comprehensive, yet very fast. So we'll certainly take a chance here to see if there are any other questions. I did answer a couple that came in, and really just want to reinforce the point that we're working on these programs literally all around the country in all different levels and types of governments. And there is no one size fits all for ERAP. It really runs the gamut from jurisdictions that are doing it entirely with their own staff and existing software applications that legacy systems they've used for years, to the other end of the spectrum where we have local governments that have contacted us and just said, we've got fatigue on this. We did the sprint with Coronavirus Relief Fund, but this is now going to go on for a year or more, given the length of time available to spend the funds. We just want to turnkey it. We know that there are some things that are inherently governmental things that we have to do on due diligence perspective, but we want to have as little direct management involvement as possible, and everything in between. We're seeing programs that are being customized to meet the needs of the area. We're seeing in California, they passed a state law that, among other things, mandates that if counties or cities opt into the state's program, they have to start taking applications on March 15th. There's a big scramble in California to get their own program started, and cities and counties that opt into the state program going, which is putting a lot of pressure on people to get programs started, and maybe along the way, some of the quality is going to be compromised. We're seeing other programs where actually in a tribal government is running an ERAP program for non-tribal members in the area because they see the need to help other rural community members that aren't even members enrolled in their tribe with the coronavirus impacts. So again, no one size fits all. Figure out what's best for you. Take the time to do it right. Get a good software application that you're comfortable with and that can be adapted to these changing programs, and roll it out when you're ready, because we know that the help is desperately needed, but taking a few extra days or even a couple of weeks to get it right will save you a lot of grief in the long run, and being able to roll out a good quality program that you don't have to pull back and then relaunch again. So with that, Eric, I think we've hit all the topics. I see one question just popped up now in the chat that we can probably try to address. Did Matthew mention that the deadline for ERA from the Consolidated Act was extended under the American Rescue Plan? So Matt, does the American Rescue Plan change anything from on the deadlines of expenditure for Consolidated Appropriations Act?
So yes, the deadline under the existing program for existing use of funds stretches the available use of funds from December. So keeping in mind that they had a amount of funds that they said that you had to spend by September, but all funds had to be expended by December. So you had to obligate funds by September. That now has been pushed off to September 2022 in the American Rescue Plan. Again, it's in the House for conciliation, so we'll want to make sure we keep an eye on what the final bill text actually says. But as it's currently written, that is what it insinuates, is that there would not just be more money coming, but there would be additional time to use those funds. What isn't immediately clear, just as a caveat, is if that utilization percentage goal through September will remain, or if it will be pushed off as well. So we'll just have to see what the Treasury interpretation of the legislation or what final legislation text looks like.
Great, Matt. Thank you. I think, Eric, that's all the questions that we've had so far. And so we're going to pass it over to you for any additional thoughts and to close out the session.
Yeah, and I know you have, I think, another webinar at 3, so I'll kind of have my questions limited. Matt, would you mind going back to slide 14? And I'm not a housing person, but I think there's a lot of interest on this issue. We have about 90 people that registered and are on. And just so I can have a framework right, I mean, I'm going to use the term, rental assistance 1.0, which was from the CARES Act, and then I will call rental 2.0 the stimulus that was passed in December. And then looking forward, I'll call the new appropriation rental 3.0. So you said the CRF money, the CARES Act money, was hyper flexible in terms of what it could be used for, and I think consequently how it was managed by locals. Mm-hmm. Under the rental assistance, the 2.0, now we have use and eligibility requirements on there for income. And what you said, I thought I heard you say, is that you could potentially take a portion of these funds that are projected to come to counties and basically have a parallel program, one that might mirror what they were doing before under the CARES Act, and then one they would have to meet the new income thresholds. Is that what you said?
That's right. So, and the truth be told, I said 120% as a representative example where you still want to have some level of prioritization, but there's not a limitation on that, right? So part of these rental assistance programs, the messaging behind it is to address housing insecurity, right? But there's also an economic component of this because many of the landlords in communities, because of the eviction moratorium, are really suffering, and they still have to make their mortgage payments if they have them, right? So part of this is not just looking at the tenants and making sure that they have a reliable house over their head or a roof over their head, right? But it's also trying to address some of the economic impacts. And so you could potentially use some of these more flexible CRF 2.0 type funds to run parallel to, in your example, the rental 3.0 funds without an income threshold, right? Now, you can work through a lot of cash very quickly by doing that. So you may want to look at other prioritization criteria. But yes, the intent here is as the bill is currently written for the local government allocations of funds, it is even more flexible than the CRF was. So you could build parallel or partnered programs. And most importantly, from a delivery perspective, right? You can streamline it. So you can have one application interface to which everybody goes and applies. And then on the back end, based on their income classification, pay them out of different buckets of money. There is some internal controls complexity there, but it at least streamlines it from the intake and delivery perspective to minimize administrative costs.
Hey, I'm
sorry, go ahead, Brad.
I was just jump in 1 second there, Matt, because we had the same question come up once that I answered earlier in the session. So it's obviously an important point. The 10% administration fee, is that 10% of what you were awarded or 10% of what you actually end up spending?
It is what you end up spending. But another thing that we want to keep an eye on with this next relief bill is they seem to loosen up what happens to the money after you're done. Or let's say that you stand up a program and are not able to spend all the money on direct rental assistance, where there's still some ambiguity in the text is they seem to open the door to say that you can use whatever's remaining after September 2022 for other housing related stability services, which would imply that there's not really any money that's being recaptured and reallocated. And so when you look at your 10%, the 10% would be on what you've received versus what you've distributed.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt. I know you guys have another webinar, and I want to thank you. I guess my takeaway from what you've said, and my head is kind of spinning by looking at all the numbers and the charts, and I appreciate you providing that, but it looks like that local governments actually have some time. We've got some extensions that will be passed for the previous money that was appropriated in December. There will be a big bucket of money coming down, again, several buckets, but the important thing is for communities to really do that self-assessment and to make sure that they kind of know what they want in terms of an end product and that the housing program that they had previously under CARES has got to look markedly different, and the sort of infrastructure they build around it has to be different. And I think we're hearing that from a couple of communities who said they're fatigued, they're tired, and they're just really not have the capacity in-house to continue to run another program. But I think what you've laid out today is pretty important. I appreciate it.
Eric, if I can make one more point, because I do think that everybody's looking at these figures and saying, well, that's a lot of money. And granted, I have a lot of time to spend it, but there's a way that you can use this money in a way to almost as a force multiplier. So I'm actually going to flip back some slides here and go to the overall bill allocations. So here we go. I think what it's important for everybody to download this is that at a local level, you may not actually see a child care development block grant program or some of these K through 12 ESSER allocations as money that's coming to you that you have a jurisdictional determination on. But if we jump down to this last bucket and the 70 billion directly for businesses, understanding a lot of this focus is going to be economically driven. If you see the $25 billion in grants for restaurants and bars, if you looked at HR 133, which had grants directly to venues, including local government venues, like if you own a municipality that owns a theater or something, right? You also look at the state being able to be allocated funds for that SSBCI that they're bringing back from 2015, 2016. If you look at the expansion of the Paycheck Protection Program that's specifically targeted towards nonprofits and other, digital media and type companies, what you can use some of the allocation of funds that you receive in the local government allocation for is to stand up services that help entities within your jurisdiction who could potentially apply to these programs through the SBA or the Treasury or Commerce directly, get access to those programs. And so that is probably a more impactful use. You can stand up a program yourself that helps do allocations to restaurants and bars, or you could stand up support services for those restaurant owners that helps them understand how they can access federal programs that run parallel to your allocation. And the ROI on that is much larger than dumping all the money into direct relief grants that you have to run compliance on. So that's a way to look at this much larger allocation of funds and all these block grant programs that you may not be familiar with, to really stand up support services at a jurisdictional level to help all of these nonprofits, healthcare institutions, small businesses access these other federal programs.
All right, there is, there's two questions, and Brad, I'll let you answer the first one. The second one, yes, we're going to have the slide deck posted to the website probably later today, or if not tomorrow. But there's one last question at the top.
Yes, I'm seeing the one, it's in the Q&A. Can we use these funds like we did the CRF fund for substantially dedicated employees? Do you think that might be an option? I assume, Matt, that's referring to the new American Rescue Plan state and local dollars.
Yeah, and looking at the 4 primary eligible uses of funds as they're outlined in the bill, respond to the public health emergency with respect to COVID-19, the presumption is yes, you would be able to use it. And then maybe something, whereas the CRF says that you couldn't give workforce bonuses, what is allocated here is the ability to provide premium pay to eligible workers. I think the terminology you use around premium pay is more oriented towards hazard pay, but maybe with more flexibility. So we'll again keep a very close eye on what the FAQ comes out from Treasury on use of these funds. But I do think that you would be able to use some of this for those payroll expenses for public health workers.
Great, Matt. And then Kristen dropped a question in the chat. Do we know yet if we can claim the entire amount of funds under the public health, public safety payroll? Again, assume relating to the new funds.
Presumption being yes. I would actually take a step back though and say, that helps with addressing the increased cost burden of providing some of these public health and public safety expenses. It certainly has a benefit of rolling general fund dollars over to the next year. Keep in mind that you have these funds available through 2024. So I would probably, from a macroeconomical standpoint, I would say, why do I have to use this funds for payroll expenses? Is because I'm losing sales tax revenue. I'm losing property tax revenue from closed businesses. What can I do to invest in those particular services to prevent that from happening year over year? That's just looking at it more strategic an investment, addressing your immediate needs, but also mitigate any further impacts.
Well, gentlemen, thank you again for the information. It's been awesome and both deep and broad. I appreciate it. I know you have another webinar. Thanks for all you do, and thanks for your partnership with FAC. And I'm going to assume if anyone that was on the webinar has questions, that they could reach out to you at Widow O'Brien's, and either by email or by telephone.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. Thanks to FAC, and thanks to the Florida family of counties. Take care and stay safe, everybody.